Hi everyone, can do the boring bit where I just try and somehow check that I'm live in all the right places. Mainly Substack is the only one I actually care about. I am probably going to move this just to Substack so that I don't have to faff with this all the time. And I've realised that might actually just be a bit of an easier thing to do. But for now, bear with for 30 seconds while I get this up. Got the email, which is a good sign, but cannot see. Deep breaths every time. Why is it so hard? Maybe I'm getting notified by it. Nah. Okay, I found myself. Not literally. Unfortunately. No, I'm joking. I feel great. Okay, right. I'm ready for today's science versus bullshit, which I'm very excited about. I do these science versus bullshit every single week because there is so much confusing and often manipulating information or misinformation, more to the point, online that leaves people confused, overwhelmed, and not actually taking any action towards their health and fitness goals. That's why I do this. So that's why I come here every single week. And hopefully it's useful for people. And the whole aim is that we help cut through some of the bullshit crap that's out there just trying to sell you stuff and help you focus on exactly what it is that you should be doing in order to get results. So first question I had today, and I have scoped this slightly more towards what I want to talk about, which is quite a political answer. Whenever people ask politicians something and they're like, great question. Anyway, back to my manifesto that I'm trying to push on you. Not quite to that extent, but someone did ask for the research and the science behind discipline. And there is some, and I do remember, I think it was like a Huberman podcast I watched on this that was like quite interesting. And Goggins talks about this a lot as well. I've never actually looked to verify the claims that they've made. I would be quite careful with those podcasts in particular. I think some of the information is absolutely incredible, but sometimes there's like a vague theory that has then been like articulated as like gospel truth. So I would bear that in mind. But anyway, they kind of talk about it in a very broad way of the more things that you do that are hard, the more discipline you will create, as in like discipline is like a muscle. The more that you use it, the easier it will be to maintain that level of discipline. The way I want to think about it, and the way that I think is actually much more useful to people, because I don't know about anybody else, but I don't resonate at all with like David Goggins style training. For anyone who doesn't know, he's like an ultra marathon, hugely impressive, like I think like ex-Navy SEAL, an absolutely amazing person with incredible mindset, but like nothing like me, and like sometimes I find things like that quite inspiring. Other times I'm like, I don't want to get up every single morning and run a marathon. Like that's not overly inspiring to me. It seems more like it's maybe a bit more of a compulsion, and then what kind of life balance do you have there? And anyway, like it's cool and each to their own, but not really of interest to me. The way I like to think about discipline is that you don't actually need very much discipline for things that you enjoy. So for example, if you think about like the definition of discipline, it would really, if you break it down, like it has to be something that you kind of don't enjoy. Otherwise it doesn't require discipline to do, right? If you enjoy it, then you want to do it. So you don't have to force yourself to do it, and thus you don't need discipline in order to do it. So an example of this might be the runner, and David Goggins might actually be a good example of this, of like, he runs a marathon every day. He likes running marathons every day. I know, mental, right? But like he likes doing that. That's why he does it. So it doesn't actually require very much discipline. And I get that there'll be some days maybe you can't be bothered, or you're a runner and you're an avid runner and you love running, but when it's dark and cold outside, it requires a bit more effort. But let's be real, you still love running. So it doesn't actually require very much discipline. And often we look at people like David Goggins, or you might like, not comparing myself at all, but you might look at me and be like, oh, you're really disciplined. You go to the gym so consistently. Yeah, because I enjoy it. And I'm gonna talk about how I've, like, made it more enjoyable. So if you're someone who's like, "Well, how am I meant to how's that helpful to me, ESG? Like, I enjoy the gym, like, that's not useful to me." Bear with, this part is coming, okay? So, if we're under the now assumption that, you only need discipline for things that you don't enjoy, one way that you could build discipline is maybe going like the Huberman, David Goggins way of like do hard things, build that discipline muscle, and then you'll be better at doing the things that you don't enjoy doing. Another way to look at it is how do I make things more enjoyable so that I don't need as much discipline, also that I can use my discipline for the things in life that I probably do still have to do that genuinely aren't enjoyable and are much harder to make enjoyable. Um, so one way that you could look at that is how can I make, say, workouts, for example, more fun or more enjoyable? Or like if you're someone who just really doesn't like exercise, like less shit. You know, I'm not going to say you're going to magically love exercise, but how do you make it fit into your life a little bit better? And the way that I did that is cut my workouts to be really short. So I'm very rarely in the gym for more than 30 minutes, usually about 20 minutes. And if someone made me do hour-long workouts or hour-long plus workouts, like, it would require quite a lot of discipline, and I'm someone who enjoys the gym, but I don't really wanna be in there for a whole hour, and I get bored after 30 minutes, and it wouldn't really be particularly enjoyable, so to finish that workout would require a lot of discipline. So I'm like, "Okay, well, how do I change that knowing that I want to, say, for example, keep the same total volume over the week? Well, that means I'm going to need to go to the gym more frequently, but for shorter periods of time. Okay, so now I've changed it to make it more enjoyable for me, right? Just slight tweaks like that. You can do that with things in your nutrition or, anything that you're thinking about, like probably could be cut down to make it work better for you. So you know the overarching principles, but you can kind of scope that a little bit more to make them work in your favor and thus require less discipline. So I'd be thinking about it more like that. Now, sorry, I didn't go and look into the science. I didn't actually have time, but I have prepped the next question, which is, can you kindly offer on one of your Q&As, sorry, can you kindly cover on one of your Q&As why we don't see many men think or plan out their food choices like women do? It seems like so many women spend a huge amount of mental energy planning food, calories, meal prep, feeding the whole family, while men in our lives often don't think about this nearly as much, yet many of them stay in decent shape without all of that planning. Why is this? Is it biological? Is it social conditioning? Is it the mental load? Would we actually benefit from being more relaxed around food the way that lots of men seem to be? Or am I just imagining it? Or maybe they just have more calories, they don't need to think about it as much in our environment. I think there's an element of truth in many of these things, right? And needless to say, not all men. But this is kind of true. And there are various reasons that this might be. Sorry, I was just double checking that I'm still in the right place. I am. Sadly, I don't really believe that just being more chill around food is going to work well for most women, especially not in the environment that we live in. It is genuinely harder for women to get in shape and stay in shape. End of, right? We have less calories to play with. We have thus less wiggle room. We have more hormonal fluctuations, meaning more cravings, meaning more sleep deprivation, meaning a higher drive to eat when you're comparing to men, right? On top of that, you also have, like you've mentioned here, like social pressures, the fact that diet culture is not exclusively aimed at women, but let's be real, like the vast majority is aimed at women. There seems to be more pressure on women to maintain a certain way or look a certain way in a way that there isn't as much on men. I'm not saying there isn't any, but there isn't as much on men. And there was another, oh yeah, and then also the fact that women tend to be primary caregivers. And again, not all women, not all men, but like that is generally what we see. Thus, there's a lot more kind of unseen and unpaid and unappreciated work a lot of the time from women that makes it harder to then look after themselves. And then there is some fairly consistent evidence that women actually have like a stronger compensatory response to energy restriction. So in anyone, when you reduce one side of the energy balance equation, hence why it's a balance equation, you often impact the other side, right? Very simple terms on this. If you increase your energy expenditure drastically, i.e. you start training for a marathon or something, your hunger will increase. If you drop your calories, your hunger will increase, right? You've changed one side of the energy balance equation, so the other side is also impacted. Now, in some people, and these are the people who tend to find it easier to lose weight, they don't have a strong compensatory response. So when they do reduce their calories, their hunger doesn't increase that much. It probably still will increase a little bit, but not that much. And when some people drop their calories to the same relative amount, their hunger compensates higher, right? So their hunger increases higher, and thus it's harder for them to stick to a deficit. The same is true with exercise. When some people exercise, it has very little impact on their hunger levels. When other people exercise, it ramps up their hunger levels. Who do you think finds it harder to lose weight, right? So there are these like genetic components, and it does seem to be that there is a sex difference within that as well. So women tend to have this higher compensatory response. That's not hugely surprising given that women would need to protect their energy stores more than men because we're more likely to have babies and pass on our genes, right? Remember that every single human trait that you have usually has some kind of evolutionary advantage. So for women, it was very important that you could store as much energy as possible and make sure that you wouldn't starve in long winters or when food was scarce so that you could then pass on your genes, right? If you ever want to read into this, there's a very interesting book called The Selfish Gene, which kind of explains how evolution works. It's a Richard Dawkins book, really, really, really fascinating. But it does make you look at the world in a slightly different way and look at human traits in a slightly different way. You're like, that's why we behave like that. Or that's why energy balance works like that. Or that's why there's this drive for hunger or this like compensatory response. So on a very practical level, women tend to find that their hunger levels will increase more in like a comparative calorie deficit, and that they will have larger decreases in spontaneous activity and NEAT when calories are dropped lower, and then potential differences in changes in things like leptin, which is a hunger hormone, thyroid hormones, and definitely in like reproductive hormones when body mass changes. There's also a little bit of evidence, but I don't think this would have from what I've seen, the impact of this would be small, but again, it adds like a kind of piece to the puzzle where women's maintenance needs are slightly lower than predicted compared to a man's, and this is even when accounting for body mass. So there's another element of this is that when you lose body mass, and say you had, again, this would be a very typical, like your typical woman versus your typical man, like this is average Jane versus average Joe. If they weighed the same weight, it's likely that Joe is going to have more metabolically active tissue and thus a higher basal metabolic rate, because men tend to have more muscle mass at the same weight compared to a woman. Not all men, not all women, but that's the average that we see. So that would also add a little bit into why calorie needs are lower, and that's why it's harder to maintain your weight, because again, you kind of have less wiggle room. And I'd say that that's probably like the fundamentally like the biggest difference between sexes, and this is heightened if you're a small woman, and this is why I talk about this quite a lot, because it is hard for anyone to maintain a healthy weight, get lean, stay in shape in the environment that we live in, under the social norms that we live in. Like, it's hard for anyone. If you're not somewhat consciously making choices in line with that goal, it's very likely that your weight will drift up. Like, this is why the average person in the UK is overweight. So bear that in mind. And then you think, right, on top of that, women have less calories to play with. Now, arguably, you'd have slightly lower hunger levels because we're slightly smaller people, but for various reasons, that may not actually be true, much like the compensatory responses I've just spoken about, but also hormonal fluctuations, especially if you're perimenopausal, then you've got cravings. Like, the likelihood is your hunger levels aren't that much different than a man's a lot of the time. And even if they are, it probably doesn't account for the portion sizes that were offered or the social norms around like drinking and how much food you eat and going out to events. And even if you look at like a really small scale, and this weekend you're going to a Christmas market and you and your husband are going to buy a hot chocolate, right? And let's say it's got marshmallows and cream and whatever, and it's like 200, 300 calories. That's going to bite into your calories much more than it's going to bite into his, right? If you need to maintain like on 2,000 odd calories and he needs to maintain on 3,000 odd calories, well, it's, a much higher percentage of your total calorie needs for the day than it is of their total calorie needs for the day. So it's much easier for men to like go and have like a Nando's a couple of times a week or go and have a hot chocolate here and there. And it probably isn't going to impact largely their energy balance, whereas it's going to have a much bigger impact on yours. And this is where, especially at this time of year, things like eating out consistently and little treats here and there actually really do add up when you're on a relatively tight calorie budget. And as I said, this is even more heightened if you are a smaller woman and if you're not particularly active. So if you're like, I've actually really struggled because I work an office job and because there's only like 5 hours of daylight at the moment. And when I leave for work, it's dark. And when I get home, it's dark and it's cold and it's wet and it's not particularly safe for me to go outside and walk loads. Okay, cool. Like now your energy expenditure is significantly lower and you're a smaller person, which means your basal metabolic rate is lower. So your total energy needs for the day are lower. And yet all portion sizes are the same, and we would probably complain if they weren't. It's just hard. Like it's a hard thing. The mindset around this has to be one of like, I'm going to accept that and then work around it instead of feeling like a victim. Like this isn't going to change. The world isn't magically going to change. Portion sizes aren't going to magically change. Like our food choices aren't going to magically be less calorically dense. Like you just have to accept, okay, that is the reality of the world. How do I want to change in order to stay lean, fit, and healthy? Or also free will. You get the choice to be like, cool, given this, I'm happy to be overweight. That's up to you. Like no one's forcing you to do anything. And then I think the final thing about sex differences is, I mentioned this before, but I think worth noting again, women are much more likely to be the primary caregivers and experience diet culture pressures slightly more. They're more likely to have obviously perimenopausal symptoms, but PMS symptoms. And those can do things like impact sleep, which then has a huge impact on your behaviors going forward. And we know from research that even a couple of nights of relatively small sleep deprivation, and now normally I'm quite good at remembering studies off the top of my head, but I think it was the comparison between like 4 hours sleep and 8 hours sleep. Yes, it was. I can visually see it now. 4 hours sleep and 8 hours sleep. And the people who only had 4 hours sleep, and this I think was only one night, but it was something like 300 to 400 calories more the next day from just that, right? And actually I have a lot of clients who struggle with sleep for various reasons, a lot of them perimenopausal women, and like 4 hours sleep is actually pretty solid. Like that's a good night. So if your hunger levels are ramped up like that as well, and your cravings are higher and you're much less likely to move as much, like all of this kind of compounds, and it's hard. Like it is, like it's really hard. It's genuinely hard. So give yourself some credit, but then you decide like, okay, do I want to be like, oh, it's hard, I'm not going to do it? Or do I be like, okay, it is quite hard. Now I understand why. And now I'm going to make these changes or decide not to. But that's your choice based on your free will. And now that you have that information. But very good question. And also, if you are a small woman and you haven't yet watched my webinar on small women, message me after this on Instagram. Just message me the word small and I'll know what you want. And I will send you it, because I think that there's a lot of like tips in there to help you. And I think sometimes like first coming across this information and being like, shit, I'm a small woman who works an office job. This is really hard. And like, I don't really like what Emma's saying, but the workshop is good because it gives you some like practical tools and how to manage hunger, how to increase your food volume, how to still eat out, but make good choices. And like, at the end of the day, I want everyone to enjoy their life and get the absolute most out of their life. But part of that does mean being, like lean, fit and healthy, because that's how you're going to feel your best and get the most out of your life and live the longest, happiest, healthiest life you can. But then part of that is also like, you obviously don't want to like miss out on social occasions or overly stress over calories and food. And actually, you can have both. Like, you can do both, and it takes a little bit of navigating, and it takes a little bit of like kind of coming back to what I spoke about at the start with discipline, and actually looking at that and being like, right, how would I make this so I need less discipline, so that's going to be more fun, so that it's going to fit in my life in a way that doesn't always feel like an absolute slog, and yeah, it's like a much like more enjoyable way for me to live my life. And you absolutely can find that. And that is essentially what I do with all of my clients and why we have such great success on Commit to Six. Okay, so next question. Please, could you do something on cortisol belly? My friends are obsessed. So my friend has a wobbly tummy and has convinced herself that she has quote unquote cortisol belly. She exercises a moderate amount. She likes wine and has a weekly takeaway, but denies herself food during the week. I know that her wobbly tum is more likely to be because of the wine, but I can't put it in a diplomatic enough way to tell her. She's also perimenopausal and has 2 children and has an active job where she's on her feet all day. Okay, so cortisol belly seems to be going around a lot at the moment. I was going to say it's a new one. I mean, it's not really a new one. It comes in little cycles. The reason that this myth won't really die, as with most myths that kind of keep coming back, is that there is a small amount of truth in this, but most of it is completely misplaced. And then like a load of like fear mongering has been chucked on top of it because people want to sell you something, right? They want to sell you their like cortisol plan, or they also like to kind of tell you a story of like, hey, it's not you. I totally get it. You're the kind of person who tries really hard, but nothing works for you. And like, you resonate with that. And oh, it's this new thing. It's the cortisol that they're not testing and that they don't know anything about and that they're suddenly going to cure you from. Like, it is really, really like ridiculous and manipulative marketing. But with a grain of truth basically comes from the fact that if you have chronically very high cortisol levels, which can come from like chronically really elevated high levels of stress, or in situations like Cushing syndrome, and then they kind of extrapolate that out to like, oh, you would never have like physiologically this level of cortisol, but when you do, which you, by the way, you don't, then someone with Cushing syndrome may have this situation where there is like weight gain associated with that. But for the vast majority of people, like, that's not you. And everyone will resonate. If you talk about feeling stressed, like everybody's stressed to an extent, you know, and everybody kind of resonates with that. And everyone has a busy life and everyone has lots of demands on them. And one thing I would really think about before I get back into this is reframing the way that you think about stress. And there's an amazing TED talk on this by Alia Crum. And she talks about how, I think the study she was talking about, they have a group of people and they show them both a video. And in one of the videos, they show stress to be a positive thing, right? So they're showing like athletes under like the highest amount of stress and how actually stress improves your performance, because these athletes are now performing at that level. Like, you don't run PBs in training, right? You run them at the Olympic Games under the most amount of stress, because that level of adrenaline like pushes you to something that you didn't think you could achieve. And then you have the other half of the group that are showing a video that shows people kind of crumbling under stress or crumbling under pressure, whether it's at work or like giving a talk, and it shows stress to be a really negative thing. And like, I don't know, families breaking up and you having arguments with your partner and all this kind of stuff. So then they do a test. And how exactly did they do this? Okay, you'll have to go and watch the TED Talk, right? The TED Talk is great, and I've now just butchered it. But basically, the crux of it is the people that think that stress is a good thing experience stress positively. The people that think that stress is a negative thing experience stress negatively. And I think that that's something to remember. And when you're thinking about this within your own life, like, people almost always use stress as a negative thing. But actually, when someone tells me they're stressed, I'm like, oh, okay, tell me why. And they're like, well, I've got this big promotion that I want to get at work, and like one of my kids is like trying to get into this university and he's studying really hard, and my other kids, just about to go off and play football in America. I don't know, like whatever. It's basically always good stuff. Or like, oh, and I've got to maintain this household. So I have my dream house, but obviously that costs money. So I want to get this promotion. Like, of course, it is all stressful, and I'm not taking away from that. But it's all good stress. Like, you're stressful because you have an incredible life. You're stressful because you have kids that are off doing amazing things, or family, even if it's not a positive thing. Like, I don't know, like I have an elderly parent that I need to look after. It's like, wow, you still have your parents here, and you get to look after them, and you have the ability to do that. And like, yes, it's stressful. I'm certainly not like gaslighting people to be like, it's not stressful, it's just all in your head. It's stressful, but I think a really nice reframe of it is like, every single stress in your life you want. If I was like, oh, you're stressed about your kids, cool. What if you just didn't have them? You're like, oh no, I love my kids. I want them. Okay, cool. You're stressed about your mortgage. Okay, what if you just didn't have that dream home? Oh no, I still want that. Okay, cool. So you're going to have to deal with the stress of paying your mortgage. You're stressed about that promotion. Okay, well, what if you just didn't apply for the promotion? That would take the stress away, right? But obviously that's not what you want. And I think that reframe, it definitely helps me. Everyone, people might be like, yeah, I didn't get that. But anyway, it definitely helps me. And go and watch the TED Talk because it's very good. Back to my point about cortisol belly, there is a small amount of science behind that, but it's usually completely misplaced. And it's usually just random people on the internet who probably don't even understand what cortisol actually is, telling you and diagnosing you with high stress, high cortisol, and cortisol belly, and now selling you some kind of solution to it. Now, what could be happening in this situation is that during perimenopause, because estrogen levels drop, you may end up storing slightly more of your body fat around your middle. That's quite a normal response to have. Obviously, that would only continue to happen if you were in a calorie surplus. What is most likely, reading this, which I'm sure will resonate with a lot of people, of like, hey, I'm pretty good during the week, I'm not so good on the weekend, I'm perimenopausal, I have 2 kids, I have a stressful job. Like, yeah, I'm sure a lot of people will resonate with that. And it feels like you're trying really hard, but you're not really getting results. Maybe it's the cortisol. It's most likely, in fact, I'm willing to bet it's not that. And if you are genuinely worried about that, don't listen to some random person on Instagram. Like, go and get tested and see if you have chronically elevated cortisol levels. I'm willing to bet that you don't. And that's a good thing, because this is something that's much more easily treatable, is actually just looking at your behaviors and stopping with the I'm good during the week and then I blow it on the weekend. The reason that that's so important to get out of that cycle is that you are putting so much effort in for no return. Because normally what's happening is you're massively over restricting during the week, feeling pretty miserable. Then by the time the weekend comes, you overeat to kind of compensate for that. That's normal human behavior. Like, over restriction causes overindulgence, right? So nothing to beat yourself up about. But why I find this like so kind of sad to see is that those people are actually working significantly harder than people who just have slightly better balance. And no one wins. You don't like lose fat for working harder. Like, no one wins any medals for making dieting harder than it needs to be. Actually, if you just had a bit more balance over the week and you learned to make more sensible choices, and you maybe learn about calorie balance, and maybe use the 3-to-1 method, because in my opinion, which is extremely biased, that is the easiest way to get in shape and stay in shape without overthinking food, and by automating some of your decisions. And if you do want to learn about that, after this, message me 3-to-1 and I will send you exactly how to do that. Works very well at this time of year, but I use it all year long. Like, it's just really simple principles to how you eat that are not over restrictive, but actually work. And they blend science with behavior change, which is where most kind of diets fail. But I think that's what's going to get you the best results. And I think that's probably what's missing. Actually, I'm not speaking to, I'm speaking to her friend, but I imagine that's what's missing. And then remember as well, like, the stress management, and that high stress, poor sleep will definitely make you hungrier, more likely to snack, less likely to move as much, less likely to train as much, more likely to rely on food for comfort, etc., etc. So do I have anything else to say on that? I think the short version is yes, like in theory, hormones can play a role, but quote unquote cortisol belly is mostly just like a marketing hook that's being thrown around at the moment because it's quite a nice story to kind of tell yourself that it's something else and it's not your behaviors. And I get why that's kind of comforting, but actually it's much better that it is yourself and then you can change those things that are within your control. And like I said, if you are genuinely worried, go and speak to a doctor and get a blood test. Don't listen to random people on Instagram. Okay, well, I hope you all enjoyed this week's Science versus Bullshit. I actually have quite a long list of things to get through. So if there's anything else you want to cover, fire away. If not, I will be back next week for probably the last one before Christmas. And if you are interested in working with me, head over to esgfitness.co.uk, fill in the application form. I would love to hear from you and I would love to help. All right, bye.